Welcome back to the Belonging at Work Summit. Our next guest is a thought leader, author, speaker, and transformer of people, cultures, and workplaces, Laurie Battaglia. Laurie is the CEO and workplace strategist of Aligned at Work in Scottsdale, Arizona. She is the creator of the Aligned at Work model, which is an integrated look at work and life and a recipe for a life well lived. During her corporate career in companies large and small, Laurie recognized that people were searching for meaning in their work and a life outside of the office. As CEO of Aligned at Work, Laurie works with companies who understand that their leaders are the ones who create a healthy, human-centered environment where they and their teams thrive. Given Laurie's commitment to building healthy workplace cultures where our teams thrive, I'll be asking her to guide us through what it means for all of us in the workplace to skillfully serve as allies to others from different generations within the workplace. We'll first frame our discussion by exploring the generational differences within the workplace, why generational allyship matters when it comes to building inclusive organizations, and of course, gain everyday strategies to help you know when to serve as a generational ally and when you may need to request support from a generational ally. Okay, so Laurie, I'm super, super thrilled that you're here. You've joined us for the summit.
Me too.
I know that you have a ton to share. So why don't we frame this discussion first by just kind of acknowledging that never before, at least in the workforce in the United States, has there been so many generations under one roof. So
Yes.
Estimates have that there are 5 generations, right? So we've got the traditionalists or the silent generation. Folks are at 75, 80 at average in the workplace. And then baby boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, and even Gen Z. So my question for you first is, what are your thoughts as to why there are so many different generations represented in today's workplace?
Well, I think there used to be this idea that we were going to automatically retire out at 65 or maybe even younger than that. And people aren't doing that anymore.
Yeah.
Where they're re-looking at the way they want to work. So it might be that they go to fewer hours, a different kind of schedule. But I'm 63 years old and a baby boomer. So of course, all my answers will be from that perspective of baby boomer. But when I look at it, there are people that are over 75 still out there working. When I look around me here in Arizona, women in particular really start businesses and stay out there well into their 70s and 80s because we tend to live longer. So I think it's a couple of things. I think it's living longer. I think it's working for benefits. I always wonder what would happen if the healthcare system totally changed in the United States.
Yeah.
And we didn't have, our benefits tied to work. Would we still do the work we do? Would we still stay as long?
Yeah.
So I think it's a lot of factors outside of work that keep us there.
Yeah. I tend to agree with that. And, there's obviously many different variables. And I think you hit on a few really key ones. And I think like the piece of living longer too, trying to stay engaged and giving as much as you can.
Yes.
That's really interesting. And it would be interesting to see if benefits were delinked from the workplace of how, like what you're saying, would folks still stay? And I think we would see still a big mix of people giving back and kind of providing expert guidance where they can. So I think that's helpful for a frame. So when we're thinking about the generations in the workplace, can you share some of your thoughts, if we break down these kind of 5 generations, what might be some of the unique strengths of each generation and where are some of the weaknesses, just to kind of help us understand when we go further in this interview of understanding where sometimes some static shows up between generations.
Yes. So I'm going to lump, for these purposes, the boomers and the silent generation together, the traditionalists together. So
Sure.
People who are late 50s up into however old they are, I think what they really bring is the wisdom of what has worked before and what hasn't worked before. And that's a blessing and a curse. Mm-hmm. So I think when we think that today's workplace is going to be very much like the workplace that we grew up in, it's just not happening. So I think that for baby boomers and traditionalists to stay alert and alive and really giving back a lot in the workplace, they have to be realizing that it's not our workplace anymore. Mm-hmm. So my hope is that when I say workplaces, all the people in them, the humans in them, that they take advantage of the wisdom that those generations bring to the workplace, especially when it comes to dealing with people. Because I think over the years, on some scale, we were taught interpersonal skills. In other ways, we were taught them more from the people around us. It might have been our parents, or maybe if we went to church or we were active in our community, there was some community norms and things that were going on out there. But we didn't have social media to put up with. So now most of us are on there. And that teaches us a different method of really almost fighting with each other. Mm-hmm. So I think that the boomers and the traditionalists bring some good interpersonal skills and some good wisdom. I always feel bad for Gen X. My son is a Gen Xer. He's 45 years old. And his generation is sort of squashed between this big, massive baby boomer generation and then the millennials or Gen Y. Mm-hmm. And they don't tend to have a voice, but they're in leadership these days.
Yes.
And they're pushing into their 50s, or they are in their 50s, I guess, if I think about what the time frame is. They're in their 40s and 50s. So they're leading, but they're squashed behind the baby boomers who aren't retiring. And then they have this other thing really pushing against them. So the one interesting thing about Gen X is they don't tend to have a really active voice out there. They don't tend to get labeled in some way other than they're cautious. They're good with technology, but they're cautious because they saw their baby boomer parents and older ones going through some bad economic times, things like that. Yeah. Millennials, they bring a wealth of knowledge to the workplace, and it's their world. So they're the ones now that are this big generation like the boomers who are coming up and saying like, no, this is the way we're going to do things. Millennials are interesting because let me say this. When they first entered the workplace, I guess I was probably in my late 40s or early 50s at that point. And I was tearing my hair out because my team at work was responsible for college recruiting. Yeah. And it was the first time I'd ever seen people bring their parents into the equation. Like literally their parents wanted to be there with them. They wanted to do the negotiating for them. And I thought, oh my Lord, they're adults, let them be. But what was interesting was the recruiters where I worked got used to it and figured out ways to include those parents in the conversation. So I think it's the first time we saw that sort of helicopter parenting happening, where they were right there. But the millennials bring such great knowledge. And I hope that they don't get, I always say the boomers came in, the generation or the part of the generation right before me is the hippies and the Vietnam War veterans and all that. And that was just before me. Yeah. And they bring in lots of, we're going to change the world. And then we became the man. So I'm really hopeful that the millennials don't become the man and, force people into these roles that don't fit them. And I'm seeing that things are shifting and changing. I'm always looking at the future. Yeah. So I'm seeing things are shifting and changing with the millennials in the workplace and taking on leadership. And lastly, Gen Z, they're my granddaughters. Yeah. So I have granddaughters that are 16 and 13, and the beginning of that generation is already there. And I don't think we're sure yet what they're going to do, but they view things even very differently than the millennial generation. So everybody comes with their own knowledge and piece of things, and they've never known a time when iPhones and social media didn't exist. So their ways of communicating are very, very different.
Oh yeah. Yeah. A couple of things that I remember learning about Gen Z is natural entrepreneurs, with like the majority wanting to start their own businesses, able to multitask using 5 screens at a time. Yes. I mean, these are the digital natives. So they've never known the world without a screen in front of their face. So, so their brains are wired differently. So I thank you for breaking that down, because I think that's really helpful for this whole conversation. Who are we talking about, and what are some of the differences between the generations? So let's talk about like the reality. You work with a lot of teams, and the teams tend to be multi-generational. So when it comes to office culture, what happens when working styles between older generations and younger generations of employees clash. So if you could help us just kind of understand what are some of the common examples of some of the generational clashes that you see when you're coming in to help teams be more productive and work better together.
Yeah, there are multiple generations in those teams. And I think the younger people, oftentimes the younger folks on the team, and I mean anybody under 45, are sort of tearing their hair out about the older ones, that they want to say, you know, those boomers don't know anything about technology. It's not actually true. We just don't use it the same way, and it looks different. But it's they're clashing over things like, I think at the heart of it, we can put those labels on like, oh, they like technology, they don't. But it's really the outlook and the worldview. And you said it, the digital natives, their brains are wired differently and they look at things. And I think every generation that comes into the workplace wants to say things about the generation before them. So when they clash, I think they clash over the what ought to be's in the workplace. Boomers tend to think things, even if no matter what our political views, we think a little more conservatively about what things should be done at work. For example, I might think that when I go to work, I have to put makeup on. And somebody else might think, yeah, I do it because I love it, or I don't do it at all. So there's sort of this dress code, the way you look, the way you act at work. You don't say this, you do say that. That's a part of the boomer generation that has gotten really, truly watered down as we go along. We didn't used to feel like you could be productive without putting your work clothes on, which I disagree with. I'm much more productive when I'm in my casual attire than I am when I'm all dressed up.
Right.
So it's just interesting to watch the way this clash goes. And then I think that in a lot of cases, the younger folks under 45 and especially under 35 and 30, when I was that age, I couldn't imagine being 63. I mean, put me out to pasture, right? And I'm just getting myself going with my own business in the last 4 or 5 years. So it's like the sky's the limit. And I don't see an end to it until I feel like it. But when I'm young, I think that those old people can't possibly have anything to say that's of any value to me because they just don't get it. And when we start really reaching out to each other and having conversations, like with anything, whether it's race, religion, gender identity, any of it, when we start having conversations and we get to know people one-on-one, that's when we really figure it out. That's when we figure out what's important to the other person and they become truly human to us. Whether they're older than us or younger than us, we start to understand their values and what value they bring.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. And I think it's just going back to having discourse, returning back to those basics. And I think that can be something that we can learn from, generations like the silent generation and baby boomers as well. So I want to kind of dive a little bit deeper around some of these myths that we've talked about each generation, generalizations. This is a whole conference about belonging at work, and we're trying to resist kind of lumping people into kind of boxes per se. Though there are kind of trends that different generations carry. So I guess my question is more, when we're talking about these clashes, and you used a great example of younger people looking towards older people in the workplace and kind of like writing off of like, we're going to have to teach this new technology, and, someone who's aging in the workplace is just not going to get it, right? How do we, when we're thinking about this topic of allyship and being allies across generations, how do we resist that and kind of check our own assumptions? When we talk about unconscious bias, ageism is a huge issue, right? So what might be some strategies that you employ, you're by yourself, or when you're working with the teams that you're trying to get to work better together? How do you help them around just kind of avoiding assumptions in general, but on this particular topic? Do you have any good suggestions here?
I think when I think about, I have kind of a reverse mentoring relationship with a woman here in the Valley. And I have learned so much. I always say that she takes me to where the cool kids are. So she would expose me to co-working spaces and startup weeks and things like that. So this is outside of the corporate space, but the lessons can be applied. So she came to me when she was running a really big all-volunteer organization because she saw me facilitate, and she said, one of my meetings went off the rails. I couldn't get it back. And I've watched you, and I don't know how you do what you do. And I said, frankly, I don't remember how I do what I do half the time either. I just do it because I've learned it way back when.
Yep.
She said, could you come in and could you facilitate these meetings for me? And I taught her things like, because we only meet every other month, every time we have to go back and meet them where they are, let them gel again and bring them forward. And she's very much a, let's just get to the point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
Me too, but it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So when I get to the what works and what doesn't work, again, it's a lot about these interpersonal interactions we have as human beings.
Yes.
Now, what did she do for me? She, I joked that she took me to where all the cool kids were hanging out. She did that. But then she introduced me to a woman in the Native American community, in the American Indian community here. And that doing something with her then led to a client that I have, a regular client that I have. And they both referred me to another American Indian client and another. And so my world grew exponentially because of my relationship with her, when really she thought she was coming to me for mentoring about meetings, but it went both ways.
Yes.
And then she made an introduction that just grew my world. And talk about unconscious biases. Most of us who are not a part of the Native American community or the indigenous community or American Indian, they call it all the above. We don't know what we don't know.
Yes.
When I met you, I didn't know what I didn't know. But when people are open to having the conversations about it, I think you grow incredibly. And I'll tell you, one thing I think is a real conversation stopper is sometimes people think, let's say, I was the only woman in the room quite a bit early in my career. I'm still sometimes the only woman in the room, but it was real common to be the only woman or the first woman who.
Yeah.
And I did feel like I carried the weight of the world on my shoulder and represented all women, but I was happy to talk to somebody if they asked me a question about what was that like. Yeah. I would try to put some words around it. Basically, it made me pretty angry for a long time, and I had a lot of therapy, and I processed a lot of that. I can't say that it still doesn't set my hair on fire if it happens again, but it's a calm fire instead of like it was in my 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
So we have to be open to the questions and the conversations. If we say, you can find that out on Google if you'd go use that. Yeah. And you just shut down the conversation and my curiosity factor, because I know now that it's not cool to ask that question. But if I don't ask that question, how do I know? And I'm not interested in what Google says. I'm interested in what you say.
Yeah.
So when we indicate in some way that we're not willing to be that spokesperson, that can really shut down the conversation. So what if you had it? What if you educated one more stupid boomer straight white woman? What if you did that? Well, her world would open up and she'd start to see things she didn't see before and really become a whole different human being. Yeah. As I feel like I've been on a major growth trajectory over the past 5 years. And before that, I thought I was pretty ahead of the curve. Right. And there's so much I don't know. And now I'm more aware of what I don't know, that there is more that I don't know.
Yeah. And I think that the example that you give is a really good one because kind of on the flip, I know, and this pops up in trans communities a lot, of people expect for many of us to kind of just, someone will walk up and say, hey, tell me your story. Tell me what it's like to be trans. And that's a little awkward, right? Yeah. But the value of what you're talking about in forging reverse mentorship relationships so for folks who aren't super familiar with this idea, it's the idea that sharing information and offering kind of professional support goes both ways. So obviously for folks who've been in the workplace for a long time, there's a lot to be shared around kind of workplace norms of any organization and kind of like how to kind of move through the organization to share with younger professionals. And as Laurie, as you shared, younger folks as well have access to a whole new network of folks that, like you said, you didn't know where the cool kids were hanging out in the co-working spaces or the startup communities. And so that's where I think the magic is, because you're building relationship professionally. You're getting to know, for the mentor-mentee relationship that you have with this younger person, you're getting to know her and her whole life, her whole story, and, different aspects of who she is, that's going to come up, like those unique experiences are going to come up organically. And as you
Yes.
build trust and rapport, that's when you can talk about some of the deeper issues that, like you said, you don't necessarily want to Google, like if you're just talking with me, you don't want to just Google what are trans experiences. Like you're
Right.
interested in getting to know Rhodes as a full human, and
Yes.
kind of where gender history pops up, because we know each other. We, there's a higher level of trust where I'm like, okay, I know Laurie's gonna, the information that I share about my own life, you're gonna hold close and you're gonna
Yes.
value that and take care of it. So, so I think that's a really good example of this nuance of education and how we share our own stories. But we
Mm-hmm.
have to have the trust, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that kind of reverse mentor relationship is so key. So I'm really glad that you brought that up as a strategy to kind of dismantle some of these myths that we carry about generations
Mm-hmm.
or different generations in the workplace. So, so let's go back to kind of building thriving teams. So this is like
Yes.
what you do in your business, and I'm wondering your thoughts on how employers. So there's a lot of folks who are on leadership teams watching this right now. How can employers prepare their management teams to navigate cross-generational teams? So specifically, what happens? I guess on the flip, what happens when
Yeah.
cross-generational managers and teams are not prepared to navigate some of these generational differences that are showing up in the workplace?
Well, they generally come from a place of stereotypes or, excuse me, or just not knowing that they don't know.
Yeah. Yep.
So there's that. I use a couple of models in my work that guide people through the process. I think it all comes down to being able to talk to each other
Yeah.
and being able to trust and ask questions. So I have a model that I use with every team event called the Drexler Civic Team Performance Model. It's about how to slow down to go fast. So get in a room together, do some get to know you activities that really dive into who you are outside of work. Because I think we bond more about who we are on a human basis outside of work than we ever bonded on, well, I hand off my work to you and then you have to do this with it. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
nice.
Right.
We're never going to invite somebody to our house probably because, or to go to a movie with them or something because they're a really good partner and when I have to hand off my work. We
Yep.
do it because we figured out that they love to save rescue animals and I love kitty cats and dogs. So let's talk about that and, show me some pictures. And I regularly have people that, oh, you're a dog person. And the person's like, hold on, let me show you, and get their phone out. And I go, hold on, let me find my cats. And I do this.
Yeah.
And so when you start having those personal conversations, it
Yeah.
starts there.
Yep.
And that builds trust. And then as we build systems together, because I believe it's Harvard that did some research around how we need to understand the systems we work in and the processes we work in. We used to think it was all interpersonal, but now it's more about the systems and the processes and understanding that, because frankly, Rhodes, you and I, if we were on the same team, could trust each other immensely.
Mm-hmm.
But if I thought you were going to do it and you thought I was going to do it, it's going to disrupt that relationship.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we've got to have both and.
Yes.
And we come together around vision, mission, but some of that is how that impacts us. What are my personal values? Does it sync up with this team? Does it sync up with this company? Because if it doesn't, out of the LGBTQ community, we've got this term covering. We cover who we are,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody covers something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's how much do we cover and for how often, because it's going to suck the life out of us.
Yeah.
So when we talk about teams coming together, all that stuff is at play. Every experience we ever had with a team or with a boss comes into play. We get tweaked when somebody says something and it reminds us of the bad boss we just left. We're like, ooh. So all that baggage comes into the room. So I like to use this model because it walks people through this kind of logical look at what the steps might be and how to accelerate faster to team performance. And then I use my own model, the Aligned at Work model, and have 5 elements to talk about. So it's things like vocation, support systems, relationships, financial understanding, well-being, and then who are you authentically and how much can you bring to the workplace. I use a couple of different models because it helps get my, I always say I think in puffy clouds. It helps get my puffy clouds down into some kind of format that I can show to other people and say, here's what we're talking about, here's what we're doing. What if we opened up these conversations and actually had conversations about this stuff? That's what brings teams together.
Yeah, I really like that approach. And, you know, I want for our audience to have some concrete steps after the conversation. So you talked about this both and approach of the conversation element, which
Yeah.
really centers around what our values are. So our kind of individual values and how they do, hopefully at least some of them, sync up with where you're working. And if they're not, that could be valuable information too. But then on this other side, you were talking about the value of systems too. So, and I'm thinking more around management techniques here. So,
Yes.
can you give us like one or two steps on how we can get more clear on what our shared values are on a team, and then maybe one or two kind of management techniques to kind of take that and kind of institute it so that we're working better together?
Yeah. Let's talk about the values for a minute. So there's a lot of different ways you can go at that. Sometimes you can get little cards with different values and you shuffle around until you come up with your top 10 or top 3. I've had people just go in small groups and brainstorm it and then look for common themes. It always starts with you individually, and then where's the common things with the team, and what do we want this team to stand for too? There's some visioning in there too, because it could just be, I'm really into freedom and independence and autonomy.
Yeah.
Most workplaces aren't, frankly. So that would be, and those are that and ethics are my top ones, but it caused me to constantly describe some employers like I would talk and I realized my hands were forming a box because I felt like I was in a box and I didn't fit it.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So sometimes there's importance, all the time there's importance in what our individual values are, but sometimes we don't sync up because we want everybody marching in formation. And I come out of the financial world, so think about that. You want your money to be someplace that's, kind of conservative and staid and probably thinks about the past, but the workplace is not like that anymore. So how do we balance? So values exercises. I was at a conference and I saw somebody do a really cool activity. And what she did was she had someone come up and she said, list your top 5 or 6, bring that sheet we just worked on and bring it up and we're going to do your top 5 values. And let's say that the person said, well, it's autonomy, independence, freedom, ethics, and cross-cultural stuff. So what she would do is she'd say, okay, now we're going to pick your top 1, autonomy or independence? And the person would sit and think and go, autonomy. Okay, autonomy or freedom. And she would keep on weighing one against the other until it had narrowed it down to the top 3. So when you have to compare one to the other, sometimes that's how you can bubble it up to what's really important.
Yeah.
With teams, sometimes, again, it's more visioning.
Yeah. I really like those activities, and I think that's helpful. In something like that, it probably would make sense to have an outside facilitator help with kind of getting clear on what the kind of individual values are and then the team values. On the flip, then, kind of thinking more of the systems that need to be in place, management techniques, what are a few strategies that you would recommend there to just kind of help teams work across generations?
I think one of the things we like to do with teams, if they need it and haven't really overtly thought about this when they're really pulling apart, we like to do ground rules of engagement, call it whatever you are, but how are we going to interact with each other? That's one thing. But when it comes more to the systems, one of the things that has been really helpful for a couple of teams, and there are a couple different models for this. So there's one called RACI, R-A-C-I, and there's another one, RAPID. But what it does is it asks all the team members, let's say that you have a boss who is stepping into every decision, or you perceive that she or he wants to be, or they want to be involved in every decision made. And that happens. Especially in smaller organizations, and it's a founder syndrome thing. I want to be engaged in everything.
Yeah.
There's an activity where we lay out and the letters stand for different things. And it's like, do I just want to be advised about this? Do I want to have decision-making power on this? Do I want to just be CC'd on it. So there's these categories, and I'm blanking on what the names of them are. But basically what it is in this decision about spending money on training for the end of the year, who needs to be involved and to what extent, and who has to ultimately sign off on it. Now that sometimes will bring up things like CEO signing off on everything, or there's this other person that thinks they need to be apprised of everything, but they're always bogged down and they can't even get to meetings on time because they're trying to get their hands in everything. So it can lay out some good policies and procedures for who's going to get, once you get that, you can kind of put it away for a while, but you've had the conversations to talk through. Does Laurie really need to be involved in that? Is it important for her to be in every meeting, or can she send us? Yeah. And then at what point will we keep her posted about what's going on, so that if she gets called on the carpet for it by her supervisor, by her manager, then she knows what's going on. How will we keep her apprised so she doesn't have to spend hours and hours and hours in meetings?
Yeah.
And imagine that.
Yeah. No, I think it breaks it down of kind of getting at, in particular, thinking of kind of maybe more senior leaders who've been around the organization. They may have founded the company wherever they're at, just to get clear on what would make them feel confident to kind of delegate to their team, allow their team to do their magic without kind of that micromanagement that, maybe other folks in the organization may be feeling. So I think that's really helpful as as a management technique. So we've talked about trying to get teams to work better together across generations. And I think these strategies are really helpful from kind of interpersonal, whatever our values, into the management techniques. So let's kind of go back then to thinking about allyship and generational allyship. What are some of the things on an individual level that we could do right now to step up when we bear witness to some form of bias due to a person's age? And that can go any which direction in terms of.
Yeah. I realized that somewhere along the way, it became obvious to me that I was doing things without realizing I was doing things. So when I got my last corporate job, I was 55 and my hair was this color. I had finally let all the dye grow out of it. And, because I thought I'll never stop dyeing my hair as long as I'm in corporate. So this hair's been natural for a long time now.
Awesome.
And people told me that there's ageism out there and you're going to walk in with that hair and you're not going to get the job. And I beat out a couple of hundred people for that job.
Nice.
And when I looked at I asked later, why that was. And my boss said, all things being equal with you and the other person that it came down to, everybody felt better after they talked to you. And so I started thinking about everybody felt better. What's that? Okay, well, I do things overtly because my goal in life is to make sure that I have positive impact on people, that their lives are better after having met me than worse. Basically it comes down to that. And if I can help them grow and develop, awesome. But it's having that respect for other people who are different than me, who are younger or older than me. And having worked for several younger bosses, the boss that I worked for there, she was 12 years younger than me and my favorite boss of all time. Mm-hmm. So what I wanted to be able to walk in natural and be valued for the wisdom that I brought and the knowledge that I brought, rather than that old bird can't possibly figure out what's going on here because how old does she look? And I heard later from somebody on the team that people had made some comments when I walked about how old I was.
Wow.
And the technology thing too, because I didn't like that bank's technology. So I played dumb, and trust me, I was playing. And we had the conversation one day about, well, you don't like technology. And I said, and you're not very good at it. And I'm like, really? So, do you have a system for, and I had started my business on the side. I was like, do you know about SEO on your website? And do you have an email system? And I started naming all these things that entrepreneurs have to know.
Yeah.
Because it's just different.
Yeah.
So what can people do? Remain open to and observe what others are doing. And rather than labeling it like that's weird, ask yourself, well, what if it wasn't? What if I'm out of touch? What if I'm weird?
Yeah.
If I'm the one that's out of touch, and that is the way it is, because when you're older looking at next generation, that's the truth. When you're younger and you don't understand why those old people are doing that. Oh, and by the way, old people my age, don't refer to people as you're just like my son, or you're just like my daughter, or my grandkids are that age, in a way that makes them feel like you're labeling, like you want to be their parent or grandparent. Because in the workplace, there's no room for that.
Yeah.
And take out the word babysitting if you've ever said that. Just throw that out, because that's annoying. So watch your language.
Yeah.
Ask questions. Set up coffee dates or lunch dates or something like that with people of different generations, so that you can really have talks about what do they like to do when they're not here. How do they operate? What systems are they? What social networks are they on these days? Be curious.
Yeah.
Is the overwhelming theme there. Be curious.
Yeah. I was thinking about like the traits of inclusive leadership, and that's high on the list, the curiosity piece. And I think that centers around being open, kind of looking at your own networks, like what you're talking about, and examine, from a generational lens, is there a good mix? And if there's not, I think there's a lot that is missing. And I think earlier on in this interview, the great example of reverse mentorship, how much you're learning from building a relationship with the younger woman that you were talking about, and how much she's learning from you, in terms of like the skills that it's just like drinking water for you in terms of facilitating, and you've mastered this craft, and that's not an easy craft to master, right? And so she's just kind of probably flabbergasted of watching you in front of a room of like, how are you doing that? Please, let's team up. And so I think that's really, really powerful. Another piece, you had shared some pretty painful examples of people demonstrating their own ageism just because of how you're wearing your hair and the color of your hair, right? So when we're bearing witness to seeing something like that happen, so for example, after you left a room, maybe your mentee is in the room and she's hearing this chatter. One, how could she, this is one example, potential hypothetical, but how could she assess first, like what her safety is in that room, kind of the power differentials? If she felt that she was safe enough to say something, what might be some strategies for her to intervene? In this instance, we'll just label her being a generational ally. And then, I guess the bigger question is, what are the strategies to kind of step up as a generational ally, when we witness this? Because I can think of a million examples of how this has shown up, both skewing to older generations and younger generations in the workplace. So curious here.
I think one of the things you can start out saying is, that hasn't been my experience with her.
Yeah.
So you can, I'm big on tiptoeing into the water sometimes, because you don't know where the blowback's going to come.
Yeah.
And I tend to do a lot of spiritual stuff. I'm a Reiki master, and I'm really into, yoga and meditation and all those and I've got my crystals and I've got all those kinds of things.
You're in good company. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm in the right place.
Yeah.
And when you're with your tribe, but sometimes you're not sure you're with your tribe. And I would find myself in this very conservative, box-like organization, having conversations one-on-one with people and saying, well, I did this past life regression. That's what actually got me to Arizona. And I stop. And sometimes they do this, really. And then that doesn't always mean what you think it means either. So I would interpret that to mean like, zip it.
Yeah. Yep.
And I say, and if they then I would generally change the subject a little bit, and then they'd come back to it and go, tell me more about that. So sometimes you have to open the door, but with the generational thing, if my friend had been in the room and heard that, she could say something like, that's not been my experience with her. And if she feels really safe, she could say, actually, it's just the opposite.
Yeah.
If not, she could just wait and see what the response was to that, and then counterattack if she not attack, but counter it a little bit with specific examples of what she experienced.
I really like that. I mean, these simple prompts that she's not engaging in kind of the office gossip, right? And so that kind of puts others on notice, not on notice, but I guess kind of showing a different way. Right. Yes. Where there's kind of the natural kind of groupthink we're pack animals. So, that it's almost kind of like a subconscious way of engaging with people and building relationship, but it's not in a positive way.
Right.
Just to have a simple phrase to disrupt and maybe kind of allow people to self-reflect and pause before they kind of pile on assumptions about another worker.
Yeah.
That's a really, really great way of just kind of, like you said, kind of tiptoeing in to change or redirect the conversation. And, and if you feel empowered and you feel safe, kind of taking it a step further of
Go
like, in
further.
fact, my experience of working with her has been the opposite.
Yeah.
Laurie's super tech savvy, or
Yeah.
so I think that's really helpful. And obviously, like, we're framing the conversation around different generations. I think that can apply for any kind of difference that we have in the workplace. If we see colleagues kind of pointing out something that's unique to a colleague, just kind of shifting that conversation in a way. And something that we haven't touched on that I just want to flag is kind of going back to what you were talking about when you decided just like you're not going to dye your hair anymore, and that like that was often the kind of helping you get more business because people trusted you because you're showing up as your authentic self, like something that to you is just like, this is who I am and I'm stepping into my power. And I think that that's also another piece as well, is like that authenticity factor. In an instance like this, if this is your younger mentee in a room, challenging assumptions, by just kind of saying, hey, that hasn't been my experience of working with Laurie. That's her being authentic, right?
Yes.
In a way of just kind of speaking her truth about what that relationship is like. And I think that's really important as well. So I just wanted to kind of lift that up because I thought that was really powerful when you were sharing it.
Yeah, it was this darn course I took. I was doing my master's degree and it was on authentic leadership. And I came home and I looked at my husband and I was like, how I would always say, and he would encourage me to grow it out all the time. And I would be like, you don't understand what it's like in corporate. I can't possibly do that. And I went through this authentic leadership course and I was like, oh no, now I'm going to have to grow my hair out. And he goes, what are you talking about? And I was like, well, you can't really be authentic if you color your hair all the time. Can you? I mean, some people are authentic and they color their hair, but for me,
totally.
That was big.
Right.
That was just a big, like, gotta uncover who I am.
Yeah. I mean, it's a form of your expression, right? And I think that's the piece, is like we all have the ability to express, ourselves through our hairstyles, our clothing, things of that nature. And it's having the freedom to do so in a way that's in alignment with who you are, right?
Yes.
And you figured out, like, by wearing your hair and styling your hair and not coloring your hair the way that you do, that just allows you to kind of focus on your genius when you're showing up in the workplace and facilitating and doing all the good work that you do.
Yeah.
So we've covered a bunch of really good content, and I'm curious, like, on this topic of allyship with respect to making the generational mix work at work, is there something that we haven't yet covered that you feel really passionately about that could help our audience just think about this topic and be more effective when they go back into their workplaces, just to show up as a generational ally?
I don't know that there's anything we haven't talked about, but I do think it's important to think about ways you can open up conversations with people who are different than you, generationally, racially, religion. Some of those get really charged. At least, on the grand scale of all things diversity and inclusion and equity, and belonging, of course, because we're all about belonging. On that scale, age is probably an easy one. Mm-hmm. Easier than some of the others. So what if you had a conversation with a younger person and try to make it as normal as possible, rather than hey, I noticed you're 23. Can we have lunch? Just what's some way when you interact at work that you can just say something like, so what are you going to do for fun this weekend? Or, what do you like to do when you're not here? I imagine you have a life outside work. What's that like? Yeah. There's ways to open that conversation. Don't be afraid of it. And really, the more we push this reverse mentoring thing, because we think it all comes down from, your age, and then you mentor people younger than you. But boy, it needs to go both ways and across. And even if you are the same age as somebody, have different experiences than you. Open up the conversation.
Yeah, I think that has kind of been the theme throughout this conversation is the power of reverse mentorship, but the underlying principle of it, which is the dialogue, the conversation, and the curiosity of understanding what the workplace was like 10, 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 years ago.
Right.
And then for younger people coming in with fresh ideas, thinking about the challenges before us. One of the conference topics for this week is talking about the future of work. For younger people, that's what they're thinking about, right? They're thinking about what work will be like in 2072.
Yes.
For a lot of us, like, we're not going to be worried about that at that time.
No.
So it's like really beneficial for us to kind of like stand in our curiosity and be open and be humble, because I think that could be a little challenging too for people who've earned their stripes and they have so much experience. And for younger people, sometimes not taking the time to maybe research all of the amazing things that you or other people have done in their careers. And so, that's where some of the static may show up. And so for younger folks, and definitely for digital natives, do your homework, when you're trying to build relationships with folks, who have the experience and some of the skills, like for your mentee, in terms of understanding how to be a master facilitator, right? Just kind of do your homework and build that trust and rapport. And I think the reverse mentorship is so key. So, this has been great. I mean, I've learned a ton. It's always fun talking with you.
Likewise.
And I'm curious, I'm sure there are many people in the audience who are excited by the work that you're doing, some of the models that you talked about, the strategies that you share when you facilitate. So where, Laurie, is the best place, the one single best place to find you online?
Even more than everything else, LinkedIn.
Oh, wow.
So
cool.
I'm on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I have an Aligned at Work website, and I can give you my contact information, but I'm sure you'll put that out there.
Yes.
LinkedIn is really where you find me, and my name is spelled funny, so Laurie Battaglia, but it is linkedin.com/in/Laurie Battaglia, and everything you ever wanted to know about me professionally, and probably a few personal ones is on there.
Yes.
You'll learn way more than you wanted to know.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Laurie. It's always a pleasure talking with you. And for everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. Please don't forget that if you want more time with these talks, if you'd like additional resources for doing this work in your organization, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out your options for getting extended access to all of the sessions and other helpful goodies using the link that's included below. And for every purchase that you make, it helps me pay for incredible speakers like Laurie for sharing their generosity, wisdom, and labor and helping us all grow the belonging movement. So thank you. And thanks again, Laurie, for being our featured belonging champion.
Thank you, Rhodes. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.